Hi friends, my name is Bo Sanders, and today I want to explain to you why evangelicals cannot do critical theory. It's not that they're unwilling to, it's that they literally can't. And I want to explain to you why. So a little bit of background first. In 2015 and 2016, I was teaching at two different evangelical seminaries at the master and doctoral level. And a friend of mine who knew I was looking for a job pulled me aside, a senior academic who I really respect, and said, hey, I got bad news for you, man. No one's going to hire you. Evangelicals don't do critical theory. They don't even know what you're talking about. And any school that does isn't going to hire you because you're a white guy in identity politics. And evangelicals aren't going to hire you because they don't know what critical theory is. And I didn't like this at first, and I sort of pushed back. And he said, well, do you know anybody who does critical theory who's still evangelical? No. And he said, do you know any evangelicals that do critical theory? And I said, maybe Lisa Sharon Harper. I don't know her work that well, but maybe her. And he's like, that's my point, is you might be able to pull one person, right? And that's the problem. This is not something that they engage. So in the years since then, the 4 years since then, I've been keeping track of this thing, and I've actually found four major blocks, major obstacles to evangelicals engaging critical theory. And the reason this is becoming relevant is that in the past months, as these demonstrations have gone by, Black Lives Matter, the statues have come down, stuff like that, I've been waiting and watching and saying, is this the moment that evangelicals finally round the corner and engage critical theory? But they have finally responded in the last couple weeks with a very critical and suspicious voice saying, this is not for us. In fact, this is a very dangerous thing. And so as I've been reading stuff that's been sent to me, because people know I sort of watch this, some patterns have emerged. And I want to talk about these four things: individualism, scholarship, Marxism and the masters of suspicion, and diversity. I think those are the four things: individualism, scholarship, Marxism, and diversity are the big obstacles here. So let's break them down. So when it comes to individualism, one of the things you have to understand, and I can link to two articles, one on the Gospel Coalition that I did a video on yesterday, like Critical Theory Will Be Our Salvation. You can look for that. But also a newer one on Christianity Today, a guest blog on Ed Stelzer's stream there by an evangelical. And she specifically names individualism and says, because we think that sin is a personal issue, that it's rooted in the human heart of the individual, we don't talk about sin as a systemic issue, right? So this is part of the barrier of language, is that we're talking past each other. And so she names it specifically. And so if you're not a part of this world, you may not understand how primary the individual is to evangelicalism. They have a personal salvation, that if you say the sinner's prayer, that you will be saved and your name will be written in the Lamb's Book of Life and you will go to heaven after you die. The entire worship service, I mean, the whole thing of evangelicalism is based on the individual. And this makes total sense when you understand that evangelicalism is manufactured. It's a construct that comes out of the Enlightenment and the Western logic of the individual. And so it's why it merges so well with capitalism and so many other things. But that limitation of thinking in the individual is the first obstacle, because critical theory is examining larger structures and systems and institutions, specifically here in racism, and power structures and dynamics. It keeps track of, it does, following Foucault, the genealogy of power and discourse analysis and who's at the table and who polices the boundaries. But if you think in the individual, you're never going to round that corner and get there. The reason this is important, it's like when you have a stereo system or a VCR and you already have something plugged into that slot. You can't also plug something else into that slot. And because in this slot of the framing mindset, being the individual as the primary location, and focus, you can't then bring in systems, structures, and institutions because something's already occupying that slot. So individualism is our first thing. Our second big thing is scholarship. And there's a real problem within evangelicalism that started about 100 years ago. Evangelicalism of the last 100 years has been a backlash against culture. It has been a withdrawal from culture. And it started, most people point to the Scopes monkey trial, the evolution versus creation debate in Dayton, Tennessee. And it was broadcast on radio. And so while technically the creationists won the debate, the trial, they lost in the court of public opinion. And that humiliation caused them to withdraw. This is why they created a parallel counterculture or subculture. So you have bookstores and Christian bookstores. You have radio stations and Christian radio stations. You have music and contemporary Christian music. You have Christian high schools, right? That withdrawal from culture and creating a subculture means you have colleges and Christian colleges. And so they have not engaged in the same sort of scholarship because of the siloing that happens when you withdraw and compartmentalize within the safety of that. And this has resulted in, say, Mark Knoll's book, The Scandal of the Evangelical Mind. There's much work has been done on this, but evangelicals, their scholarship is not engaging this kind of an academic, for us, critical theory. And so they just don't have people on their bench to pull out at a minute like this and give to the platform. And that's why you see the Gospel Coalition article that I did a video on yesterday. That guy is a theoretical chemist. Well, why is he talking about critical theory? And the one on the Christianity Today, her specialty is 19th century Russian literature. And you think, do they not have anybody who does critical theory? And I'm telling you, the answer is no. Now, you may be able to point me to one or two people, but that would actually prove my point, is if you can find just a handful of people or one exemplar, is that that's the exception that proves the rule, that this is just not something that they participate in. It's not a part of that subculture's scholarship. And so that's issue number 2. Issue number 3 comes up with their fascination with Marx. And so this cultural Marxism is used as, I'm going to say, a boogeyman. It's very distracting because it would be like if I was trying to criticize economists and I kept referencing Adam Smith. And they would say, man, we don't actually read Adam Smith. So much work has been done since then. Things have evolved and adapted and migrated. But you're obsessed with Adam Smith, right? And it's the same thing that happens with Marx. I would say the vast majority of people who do critical theory maybe haven't even read Marx. The legacy of Marxism, right, has resulted in like the Frankfurt School in the early part of the 20th century, but so much work since then. But this actually points to a problem with that withdrawal from culture. This thinker that I love, Ricoeur, he has a thing he calls the masters of suspicion. So it's Freud, Nietzsche, Darwin, Marx, right, and Feuerbach sometimes gets lumped in there. But they're the critical in critical theory. And so they bring that critique, that examination, that hermeneutic of suspicion. But because evangelicals withdrew from that critique and they set that up as the enemy or the other side, they haven't engaged in that level of scholarship or engaged those thinkers, because what they've put all their energy into is building defenses against that. So they have one line that dismisses an entire field. So like Darwin, I didn't evolve from monkeys. Freud, I don't want to sleep with my mother. Marx, I don't, communists, right? They always go to communists. On and on, right? With Nietzsche, God's not dead. They have one sentence responses to the masters of suspicion. But what happened is, by not engaging in those thinkers from the 1800s that were so influential in the 19th century, that they actually sort of missed the boat when the next wave came, not just the Frankfurt School, but specifically in French deconstruction. because most people, I think, that are doing critical theory are engaging newer thinkers. But in this instance, the wave was Foucault and Derrida and Lyotard, what gets called the postmodern turn. They didn't engage that either. So they're actually like at least 40 years behind, maybe 100 years behind, in processing and engaging in the program that critical theory is a part of. And I'm trying to give these evangelicals the benefit of the doubt and say, well, they might just be naive or unschooled in this, but I'm afraid that it might also be a little bit cynical to hold up Marx and that leftover fear of the Cold War and saying Marx, communism, millions die, right? But that's not, I mean, you can do critical theory without ever having read Marx. It's performing like a boogeyman, and so there's something wonky there, and the fact that the writers that specifically that I'm talking about today keep using Marx as a barrier to doing critical theory lets me know that they're really afraid of this, and when you don't want to do something, almost anything is a good excuse not to do it. Now, the last of the four obstacles is a little trickier, and it's diversity. Evangelicals really prize diversity. It's one of their big things. And because of the legacy of colonial missions, they've actually made lots of converts, and so they have a diverse representation, not in leadership, but in population, right, demographics. But one of the things that has happened, and Randy Woodley pointed this out to me for the first time, but once I saw it, I actually found it in many other areas, is because diversity can be framed in a positive or constructive way, a celebration of diversity, they don't have to deal with race specifically, and more specifically, critical race theory. Because they want to put forward diversity as a prize, then they don't have to do the negative or the deconstructive, the critical move of examining leadership structures, empowerment, education, recruitment, funding, all the stuff that critical theory would be so fascinated with is institutions, structures, and organizations. Because it's the individual, and we celebrate the diversity of those individuals, right? So you can see how these four things sort of dovetail together. They're like interlocking gears in a big machine. So why can't evangelicals do critical theory, right? So I've outlined these four things, but what's the final straw? What's the big thing at the end? It's the nature of evangelicalism. And this is what most people don't understand. If you ask somebody to define evangelicalism, they're going to struggle. I mean, the closest thing I've ever seen is either Bebbington's quad, right, his four, but that was Britain, right? That's a European evangelicalism that he studied. Or they'll say, like, you know, if you like Billy Graham, but of course now we have Franklin, and so that's gotten muddy too. People have real trouble defining evangelicalism because evangelicalism, it turns out, is just a set of conclusions. It's not the investigation, it's not the journey, it's a destination. And because you come in with these predetermined conclusions, you are not free to do inquiry wherever it leads. This is why evangelicals cannot do critical theory, is because if you ask different questions that lead to different conclusions, then you're no longer evangelical. It's a bounded set. It's a predetermined boundary, right? That you're either in or out because it's a set of conclusions. You can't be evangelical and come to different conclusions, or you're outside the boundary of evangelicalism, and they police those boundaries. The gatekeepers are legit within evangelicalism. And so these four things, and then the big way that they come together, means that, I mean, it just makes so much sense. And what you're seeing now, this backlash against the protests, against issues of race, against Black Lives Matter, is because the very nature of the individualism, the lack of scholarship, the withdrawal from culture into a subculture, using Marx as a boogeyman and staying away from the masters of suspicion, and the legacy, the descendants of those in French deconstruction and post-structuralism and all that good stuff. And then hiding behind diversity, you put these things together and it makes total sense why you get the manifestation, the expression that we have seen in the last couple weeks. I hope that was helpful. I know those are some wild concepts if you're not familiar, if you don't live in this world, but I hope that was helpful, and I would love to get your feedback, any questions, comments, concerns. I love this conversation, and I'm very concerned about this current backlash and the hesitation to engage in this topic with good faith and sincerity, but instead to distance from that in order to guard the pre-established conclusions that defines evangelicalism.